Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. This is Ukraine War Frontline update for the 28th of August 2023. It's a little bit later than it would otherwise be. Apologies for that. I've had a day full of family round. It's my twin's birthday, as some of you know, because I said it earlier. And I'm just celebrating now that everyone's left with a Hugo. Love these. Found out about these on holidays. Not something I normally drink at home. I'd be on a beer or a red wine now, but this is a Hugo sparkling wine and elderflower cordial with some fresh mint from the garden. And I'll tell you what, I'm not ashamed to say it's bloody lush. Right, okay. Shut up, Piers. Get on with it. Right, we'll go to... this is really random. We go to the front line. So a lot of information coming out about the front line, but not a lot coming from the sort of northeast, anywhere north of Bakhmut is kind of repelled attacks, the usual situation that we hear about in places like the ISW. I'm not going to go through with a fine-tooth comb what the ISW have said because it's basically they're almost going to be bringing out their next day's report. Please check out what the line's been on my map by looking at this this image that gives you the map legend. Pause the video. Right, let's get on with it. So we're going to go down to Bakhmut. And start there and go south. So in Bakhmut, we have our usual lines. The white one, remember, is where they've moved from before the counteroffensive. It's a slow, grinding move forward. There are some moves for the Ukrainians in terms of gaining some territory around Andriivka a little bit. I'm going to talk about that in a second, and some claims about Klishchivka as well. But it seems odd that Suryak Maps, a pro-Russian mapper here, has Klishchivka fully under the control of the Russians. That seems really bizarre. I don't think that you can say that now with all the data we're seeing, geolocated footage and whatnot. Now, Suryak Maps have updated their map just now after a 2-day kind of hiatus for whatever reason. And they've made some changes around Robotyne where it's kind of, incontrovertible that there have been gains for the Ukrainians around there. But they're still keeping this narrative up that Klishchivka is under Russian control. So I don't really get that. Right. Ukrainian Armed Forces, says this source, drove the occupants out of their positions east of Klishchivka and in the central part. The occupiers have to throw reserves to Klishchivka. So it's the idea that the Russians are throwing reserves into this area to hold on to the lines they have. As you can see, a deep state map here says that the Russians still have control of the northern part of Klishchivka here, northeastern part. Andrew Perpetua says really the whole place is a grey zone. Well, actually, no, the northern part is a grey zone. He has Ukrainians in control of the southern part of Klishchivka and the Russian defensive line pushed back to the railway line. So you see this different interpretation. I would say it's going to be Deep State and Andrew Perpetua sort of together there on that one. Another source saying the Ukrainian Armed Forces, this is Hanna Maliya, I think. Oh, no, it's Deep State saying this. But Hanna Maliya, the Deputy Defense Minister, has just come out recently and mentioned that there are some successes around this area. The Ukrainian Armed Forces have advanced in the Andriivka area near Bakhmut. The Russians continue to fight to hold this strategically important village of Klishchivka. They are introducing reserves. So it's kind of what we just heard. Right. What Deep State Map have done is, I think, a really tiny change, but it's actually fairly significant if I'm interpreting this correctly. So they have basically moved, this yellow line is Deep State Maps line, right, which is the Russian, as we know, the Russian defensive line. And they have moved this line from basically going here to going just behind that tree line. Now, why that is significant, because it now means, so the Russians, this is a raised embankment. This is a railway line with a raised embankment with tree lines on both sides of the raised railway. And this is kind of where the Russians have been pushed back to. But here we have a very minor change, as I say, on Deep State Map, that shows that this tree line now is a contested area and the Russian defensive line is back to the railway line. And that is the only change that Deep State Map have. So to say that the Ukrainian armed forces have advanced in the Andriivka area, which is this area, is to say that actually they've advanced, Andriivka is here, they've advanced just, around this tree line and have pushed the Russians back. Now, why that's significant, it seems hardly significant at all. It's just one small tree line here, but actually this is a significant Russian defensive line. And it's a bit like the trenches down south. If the Ukrainians can breach this defensive line anywhere, and it seems most likely, at least so say some of the sources, that they're going to breach it around the Andriivka to Kurdyivka area. This is where they're having the most success. Then that will allow them to break across there and circle back behind and effectively a breakthrough. So that is actually, as tiny as that gain is, I think it's fairly significant. And then, as I say, some activity in Klishivka as well. Right, coming away from Bakhmut, we will come down south, go right past Shumi and New York, and actually we're going to stop in not in Avdiivka, but to the north of Avdiivka, where Andrew Perpetua, the mapper who's signified by the blue line here, his map is signified by the blue line, has shown some interesting increases in Ukrainian controlled territory here, and pushed the Russian control line back from another railway line where they were holding out, or they're pushed to actually, and the Ukrainians had kept them to that railway line for some time now. And now it appears that they've been pushed back from there just north of Krasnohorivka. And I think that's pretty significant. I'd not heard any activity, particularly around this area, for some time. Since the counteroffensive started, it all started going a little bit quieter around this Novokalnyove, Karamik area, and we had Stepova, if you can remember here. But it appears that the Russians have been pushed back north of Avdiivka, and again, fairly significant, because will this mean that the Russians will go, oh, hang on, this is a problem, we're going to have to move troops from somewhere else to plug the holes here, and is it another game of whack-a-mole, or is it just a random bit of gain that the Ukrainians have just somehow managed to make in that area? I don't know whether it signifies anything more, but it's good to have these kind of gains to keep the Russians thinking. Right, okay, we'll come now down to Uruzhany area. Just thinking if I had any other sources. Before we get to Uruzhany, though, there is an interesting other. It's rather similar to what I was just saying about Krasnohorivka to the north of Avdiivka. Do we have other places where the Ukrainians are just prodding and probing, having some success, and then it's back to this kind of whack-a-mole game for the Russians, and they have to plug all these holes? And here's another one just to the southwest of Pavlivka. We know that the Ukrainians have been active around here previously, but in Pavlivka over the last week, but also here around Shevchenko. They did make some gains here some time back. They made some gains between Pavlivka and Shevchenko some time back as well, just around here where my cursor is. So here we have seen the line on Andrew Perpetua's map go across there, which is showing a fairly significant gain for the Ukrainians here. Now, it's worth noting that Suryat Maps has that pretty much where the Russians were anyway. So whether this is a definite gain for the Ukrainians over the last 24 hours or so, or whether this is rejigging of the map by Andrew Perpetua, I can't say at the moment until further detail comes out. He said this on his live stream the other night, that actually it's really frustrating, this area, because the satellites don't pass over this as much. And when they do, they just seem to have a lot of cloud cover. He's quite unlucky with getting good pictures from this area. And he says, therefore, he can't always keep us up to date in this area as he can literally just to the west of there. So, both Robotyne and the Velika Novosilka salients have quite good satellite coverage, but for some reason, the Sentinel satellite just often misses this area out. So that might affect his mapping. It might be that he's just got some good images that means he can rejig this area, or indeed that the Ukrainians have made some gains there, which would be good news, of course, if you're pro-Ukrainian. Right, as we come to the west here, we come to Staromaiorske, Uruzhany, Zavitne Bajanya, where I hadn't heard anything happening for the last sort of 3 or 4 days, other than the odd first-person view strike footage, so on and so forth. But there is some news just coming out pretty much in the last hour or so, that the Ukrainians are making further gains in this area that was holding out, that was northeast of Priutne. Now, if you remember, this is higher ground here, and you've got a ravine here to the north that's been heavily mined, that's acted as a kind of front line, a barrier, a natural barrier, as well as the unnatural barrier of mines. that has meant that the Ukrainians were struggling to take that head on, and really had to wait till Staromaiorske had been successfully taken and Orozhany, so they could safely sort of get in from the east, and also when they're pressuring Pryutny from the north, also come in from the west and start chipping away. And they've been chipping away at this over the last week or so and have been making gains. And now they appear to have made more substantial gains. Global War Monitor here has an even flatter front line than, say, Andrew Perpetua. So Andrew Perpetua's gains here, the blue line kind of went up to where Syriac Maps had it, give or take. And Andrew Perpetua changed that in his last map update, but today's news is probably more recent than Andrew Perpetua's mapping, and would indicate, if Global War Monitor is correct, that it is flattened off quite considerably. The clarification of Ukraine's gains near Pryutny and Staromaiorske, 6 square kilometers has been added to the liberated status, and that's a considerable gain in one fell swoop. Here is another source saying Pryutny Staromaiorske, the Ukrainians are equating the front. What he means there, a bit of a translation issue, which is kind of equalizing, flattening the front here. So it's that area to the up to the ravine there. So let's see if we can get that bigger. So that's that ravine part. And although this is the Ukrainian front line and this is all grey zone, the Russians have been pushed back from here to there, and they're being pushed further back, and equalising the front line would make it look flat across there, rather like we have, with Global War Monitor there, so a much flatter line for them. So it could be that continues to change over. Andrew Perpetua's next update might see a flattening off of that, but there's certainly some activity there, which is good news for the Ukrainians, especially since they're not being incredibly active in this whole sector because they are refitting, ready for another push. So it's a bit of I don't know whether they have had a full rotation here or whether the same units are just pausing, operational pause, and refitting themselves rather than exchanging, units for different units. Right, now let's go on to where a lot of the action is happening down in Robotyne, but I'm just going to break now for a little Hugo time. Sweet minty mother of God. Right, okay, let's go to the west. We are going to pass Drozhnyanka. Not heard anything about that for the last few days, considering there were rumours that the Ukrainians might be pressing there as well to keep the options open for them. Right. As you can see, a lot of pins here, and this is because Syriac Maps has updated after a 2-day lack of update. So there are significant gains to the Ukrainians here, but that might not be today's activities. That's going to be the last 2 days, and now they're starting to align in the mapping more with Andrew Perpetua. It was looking quite, the two mappers were quite disparate in their lines here. So anyway, let's go to what I essentially shared with you earlier today in my news piece. So Defense Ministry, this is from pretty much this morning, yesterday, some of these sources. So Ukrainian forces had liberated Robotyne. You still had some people, Syriac Maps was saying, and I don't know what their position still is, they were saying that the Ukrainians had been counterattacked and pushed back in Robotyne and the Russians were in the southern outskirts. Well, officially, the general staff of the Ukrainian armed forces have said, no, Robotyne has been liberated. And in fact, definitely the case because, no, we're going to come to that later, because where do we have it? I'm sure I have it somewhere. No. Yes, here it is. It was next. I actually put it in the right place. Goodness me. So Robotyne is so over, says Barracuda. Russians are shelling the southern outskirts of Robotyne. What that means is that the Russians are definitely not in the southern outskirts of Robotyne because they're the ones shelling it. So, if the Russians were still fighting over Robotyne, then they're not going to be shelling themselves. Okay, so it seems fairly conclusive that the Russians are not here and they have been pushed back. And then there's lots of talk about actually the Ukrainians are attacking on the outskirts of Novopokrovka. Now, Emil Castellhelmi talks a lot about the situation with the trenches in this whole sector, and I said I'd share this with you. So here's a bit of an analysis, which will make this video a little bit longer, but I think it's worth going through. The Ukrainian offensive in the Robotyne sector has progressed, and the first Russian defense line has been reached. In this thread, we'll take a closer look at the main defensive line and what might happen next. This thread includes high-resolution satellite imagery. So if you remember from yesterday, the Russians have been pushed back to their, basically, I think that's their tank trench line, and behind is their manned trench line. It's a lot closer on this heights here. Here are some heights between Novopokrovka and Verbove, and you've got this hill, I think it's hill 166. It's 166 meters high, and it sort of slopes down towards Verbove and slopes down towards Novopokrovka. Okay. So he then says Ukrainians have been trying to advance in the Robotyne area since June. Over 2.5 months of fighting, Ukraine has liberated most of Robotyne. I think that's all now, and continued south, bypassing Novopokrovka. So it's the idea that they're actually not necessarily going to fight through it. As you can see, there are some defenses to the north of Novopokrovka. They might be flanking it from both sides in the hope that the Russians will pull out without having to fight through the settlement. In this map, you can see the southern front on the 1st of June and now the 27th of August. So you can see this lighter pink area there is where the Ukrainians have moved from the beginning of the counteroffensive. We had some gains around Piatikaki that now seems to have stopped. We have the Velika Novosilka sector that has produced sort of the most land in terms of territory gained. And then here, hard fought for around Robotyne. The first significant fortified obstacle is located just outside Robotyne. The Russians have prepared formidable defences, which include covered firing positions and bunkers. From here, the Russians can defend against attacks from both north and east. Zoom in for details. So you can sort of check this out yourself and see what different elements of the defences are. Bunkers, steel elements for roofs, covered trench and fighting positions, communication trench in the tree line, vehicle shelters, all this kind of stuff. Okay. At the moment, it seems like Ukraine doesn't want to attack straight towards those heavily fortified positions. Instead, they're flanking the whole village of Novopokrovka and have established themselves between the positions south of Robotyne and the main defense line. So going back to this image, they don't want to negotiate these and have to fight through these defenses to the north of Novopokrovka. As I was saying, they need to flank, so they are not going to trip themselves too heavily. Okay, the Ukrainians roughly have two immediate directions. Try to open up the main road in Novopokrovka and continue towards the heavier main defense fortifications at Solodka Balka, or try to breach the main defensive line near Verbove and continue towards Ocheretuvati. Now, there are some serious fortifications around Ocheretuvati and go north towards Verbove, but they could try and roll down the trench lines rather than try and take them head on at different places. So if they can breach the lines here, or indeed here, they can move up the trench lines and round them and roll down them in that way. Or they could, try and force their way through, break through some weaker points, or they can move, around Novopokrovka and move towards Solodka Balka there. So on my map, just to give you an idea, if you come down to the south of Novopokrovka, you've got or southeast, southwest, sorry, you've got Solodka Balka here. So they can either try and sort of flank around there, or move through Verbove and down to Ocheretuvati there. That's what he's talking about. Okay, then if we go back to where we were, so here. Let's take a look at the defenses in the village of Solodka Balka. At the beginning of August, Russians were improving the positions they built during spring. You can see a lot of construction material, especially steel elements, which are used as roof material. So anti-tank ditch, dragon's teeth. So these, you might laugh at dragon's teeth, but 3 lines of dragon's teeth is something to think about. Whereas if they weren't there, no problem, you just drive through. So they still prevent a quick Ukrainian assault. They still are something that need to be breached. You will still need some kind of vehicle to probably clear them that isn't just a Bradley IFV, for example. Communication trenches, covered trenches and fighting positions, vehicle shelters. So these are all pieces of evidence to suggest that this is a really well thought out bit of defense line here that will be more difficult for the Ukrainians to breach. He continues, the Russians have built 100 to 350-meter long communications trenches, which help them both reinforce or retreat from the fighting positions. The built area of the village works as a buffer zone, and immediately after the village ends, another trench line begins. Heavy fortifications are built in order to block any potential advance on the main road towards Tokmak. This is an important avenue of approach, so defending it is very logical. However, while concentrating on this section, the Russians may have missed something important. So just to let you know, this is Tokmak, not too far away now, sort of fighting down from Solodka Balka through to Tokmak there. We'll go back to Emil here. And in fact, I'm just going to go, I just want to see if Tokmak, no, Tokmak isn't on that map. So unfortunately, you can't quite see it. But on this one, that's somewhat zoomed out, yeah, it's there. So, you know, they're going to be fighting through quite some defense lines as they come southwest towards Tokmak there. Right, let's get back to what he was saying. So heavy fortifications are built in order to block potential advance on the main roads towards Tokmak, but they might have missed something. The main defense line west of Verbove seems to be in a significantly worse state. At the beginning of August, no preparation work for finalising these trenches had begun. At the end of August, low-resolution images show almost no signs of any trench improvements either. So you've got the main trench, anti-tank ditch, and Dragon's Teeth, and there you go. There are sections with no covered firing positions and very few accommodation bunkers, even though great effort was put into this in other places. However, the Russians tend to fortify the tree lines, but only limited indicators of this can be seen in these images. So when you look at certain areas, they don't have what we saw back here, which, you know, looked like consistently heavily fortified areas with all sorts of different things, bunkers, metal roofs, revetments, and so on and so forth. But now, you know, as we come to certain areas, it looks like the Russians have something of a variation in their fortifications. So there are sections with no cover firing positions, very few accommodation bunkers, even though great efforts put into other places. However, the Russians tend to fortify the tree lines, but only limited indicators of this can be seen in these images. Right. The topographic heat map gives also some additional insight to the battlefield. Russians have constructed most of their defenses on dominant heights, and there is no way to completely avoid fighting uphill. In other words, this 166 hill between Novoprokopivka and Verbove is, as you can see, on the highest part of the land, and kind of follows the ridge along here. For the Ukrainians to take this, they had to fight uphill coming from the south, or even if they come from the from the north there, even if they come from the east, they have to sort of fight uphill and then go along the ridge, and the same with, you know, fighting through to the west. So the highlighted ridge is the next tactically central point, and that's what they're fighting over right now. The height differences are not extremely dramatic, and the tree lines reduce the Russian field of fire in this area. The best attempt for the Ukrainians would likely be to continue forward, breach the line between Solodka Balka and Verbove, and start flanking operations. So it is taking the highest point here, taking this hill in the middle, and that is indeed, as I say, what they are doing. This situation would provide a better basis for future operations. For example, attacking the actual villages of Verbove and Novoprokopivka. Widening the salient is necessary in order to create a sustainable front line. Okay, let's look on my map. So that's to say, taking this hill here is going to be important for then that breakthrough, breaching the main line of defense, having the breakthrough there, circling back round and being able to take Novoprokopivka, because you have flanked it, you pretty much encircled it and attacking from the rear. The same with Verbove. A lot of these defenses are made in such a way that you know, if we look at Andrew Perpetua's map here, that, you know, they're great for defending if the attackers are coming at you from the north, but if you breach somewhere and are attacking from the south, the trenches don't work as well both ways. You might just think a trench going like that or even zigzagging might work just as effectively going forward as backwards, but they do have a difference between the back and the front, and lines of fire, and so they'll be built to give you optimal defensive capability against that direction that the enemy is going to be coming in. So therefore, if they're attacking you from the rear, they are going to be less effective. So that breakthrough is super important. And they also need to widen the front line, because if you have a very thin salient coming down here, then you can be cut off back at the top, and it needs to be consistently widened, and then supply is easier. The Russians won't be able to get fire control over supply lines coming through the center of the salient then, and so on and so forth. So soon the Ukrainians have to start clearing the flanks more intensively. The offensive cannot continue south indefinitely. Ukrainians must at some point start focusing more on Kopani and Verbove. In other words, exactly what I was just saying. You can't just keep going south. You need to widen that salient. You'll need to take Kopani, you'll need to take Verbove, so on and so forth. And as that keeps going, this will get wider and wider. Nesterianka, Novopokrovka, and then so on and so forth, gets wider and wider. And then eventually, the idea would be you would be level with Tokmak. And then, as I've said before, that gives you fire control over the the coast there, Berdyansk, and all along the coast, which then cuts off these logistics lines too. Okay, so back to what Emil was saying here. Ukraine may face challenges in force distribution and prioritization. That, of course, will be the same for the Russians. If the attacks in the flanks do not succeed, the spearhead will also slow down, giving the Russians time to prepare defenses in depth. This is actually happening already. The Russians have started constructing additional defense lines in the Berdyansk and Mariupol directions. So the main point of this thread is that fortifications are not as strong in all areas of the first main defensive line, known as the Surovikin line. Russian preparedness also varies. Positive developments for Ukraine are possible in the near future, especially local successes. That's all that needs to be said there. So I think that was a useful little thread. Gives you an understanding of the topography as well in this area. Saves me bringing up the topographic map. So thank you very much to Emil there. Right, going on to Astraya Intel. The battle for Novoprokopivka has officially begun. So this is a claim that that there is fighting in and around that settlement of Novoprokopivka too. War Frontline said after the liberation of Robotyne, the flanks in the Verbove area are dangerously wide open for the Russians. In addition, the 12 kilometers between the two villages will be extremely difficult for Russia to defend, since the reinforcements will have to move under Ukrainian supervision and artillery, which makes a large transfer of reserves practically impossible. Some will be destroyed along the way. And in fact, reporting from Ukraine talked about how sort of a whole bunch, how many truckloads, maybe 13 trucks or something like that, of reinforcements came into the Novoprokopivka area from the Russians. And that shows that they have lost an awful lot of troops themselves, because they need those reinforcements. And of course, they then are vulnerable to being attacked with first-person view drones, with artillery, so on and so forth. Ukrainian troops are getting closer to liberating Verbove after having broken through Russian defensive lines in front of the settlement. Now, I haven't seen confirmation of this. This is Visegrad 24, so take it with a pinch of salt. But the claims are that in this Verbove area, the Ukrainians have pushed through the defensive line of the Russians. It's probably better to look at Perpetua's map here, because it has those defensive lines. So somewhere here, or several places here, as according to that source, the Ukrainians have broken through. Again, it could be that the tank, it would be rather simple, I think, with a few engineering vehicles to get through these tank ditches. But when it comes to these manned trenches, where you've got a lot of fire and observation of fire, then it'll be somewhat more difficult, would be my guess. Okay, then moving on, we have an update from Osint Yuri saying that no confirmation from the Ukrainian General Staff, but Russian mill bloggers are reporting that Ukrainians have broken through at Verbove. If this is true, he says, then the 46th Air Mobile Brigade this will be the 46th, and it is huge in many ways, especially combined with the Ukrainian report that the 82nd Air Assault Brigade has also moved on Novoprokopivka. This means that the main lines of the Russian defences in the sector have been breached. Quote from Belarusian Silovik, I don't know if this is pro-Ukrainian or pro-Russian source, but a colleague of Ossetians reports that the deep reconnaissance group has broken through at Verbove. So I would guess that's an Ossetian fighter for the Russians. A breakthrough, this is another quote from Ossetin, breakthrough of the Ukrainians in Verbove, destroy them, brothers. So this is, I think, a pro-Russian source saying that those Russian Ukrainians that have broken through should be destroyed. So those are two Russian sources claiming the breakthrough, and confirmation from another Russian source that Ukrainians are advancing between Novoprokopivka and Verbove and taking the key heights that will open the doors to the Sea of Azov. And I read this to you before. I found this quite interesting. So while military rats are joking with standard blanks about Babkusel, I don't know what that means in the lowlands, which no one needs, but we'll see what they're start writing when the crest reaches Tokmak. And there is only one clue to everything: the lack of reserves, which the Tuvan degenerate, so that's he's slagging off Shoigu, who is Tuvan, did not prepare. So this is to say that the Russians are lacking in reserves, according to this Russian source. And then Astraya Intel is saying the Ukrainian infantry is storming enemy positions in Novopokrovka. This is not Novopokrovka, but this settlement just to the northeast here that is apparently under a lot of pressure as well. It could well be being attacked directly. We know that to the south that the Ukrainians have made some gains and are perhaps encircling the settlement as a whole there. So that would be very interesting. The northern part of the settlement is now disputed, so grey area there, grey zone there, as according to Astraya Intel. And then this has just come out from George Barros, who is with the Institute for the Study of War. He says Ukrainian forces may be attempting to breach the Russian tank ditch between Verbove and Robotyne. Here's a quick thread. NASA's VIRS sensor picked up heat anomalies next to a segment of the tank ditch on August the 27th, so that's yesterday, near this position. Right, let's go and find that on my map just to give you an idea of exactly where we are talking about. Everyone loves a geolocation, right? At least I would do if I got it right. Okay, so here it is right there on the Russian defensive line there. The Andrew Perpetua's map has that where the Russians are. And it could be the Ukrainians are trying to assault there and were yesterday. And the reason he says that, if you want to have a look there, there's a difference between these two images, very much blacker there, scorched earth it seems. Right, imagery collected on the 28th shows extensive brush burns marks near the tank ditch and even some burns between the ditch and the dragon's teeth. In other words, they have overcome the dragon's teeth and are moving on the tank ditch. Dragon's teeth circled in red there. So I guess that's dragon's teeth maybe going there, and then you might have another ditch there. I don't know if you can see there's a slightly lighter line there, so that could be dragon's teeth here, a ditch there. I don't know if that's a tank ditch, and then maybe the here might be the manned trench. I don't know. I'm definitely guessing. So an alternative hypothesis is that these observed burns could be from Ukrainian indirect fire against Russian forces in the area, but I think that's unlikely given Russian forces are deployed in hedgerows and fighting positions largely separate of the tank ditches. Russian sources also report a Ukrainian advance. Well, Gonzo reported on August the 27th, so yesterday, that the current Ukrainian front line is 4 kilometers from Verbove following a Ukrainian advance. The observed burns are consistent with this Russian report and are almost exactly 4 kilometers west of Verbove. Okay. Russian mill blogger Rebar's latest map from August 28th paints a similar story, showing Ukrainian forces closer to Verbove. The map notably shows Ukrainian forces right up against the Russian tank ditch in the same area where the observed burn marks are. So I love it where there's this confluence of data to give you a much richer picture of what is going on. And here we have Russian sources making claims. We have Ukrainian sources sort of making some claims as well, but wondering, are they that far? Then we've got like sensor data from NASA giving us an indication that yes, that all makes sense, and we can trust those sources. So the question is, have those lines been breached around Verbove, as many are claiming? That data was from yesterday, satellite data from yesterday. We've had pretty much 2 days of fighting since then. It'll be interesting to see where we are at now. That's pretty much that. That's all I have for you for today. I've no information about Kherson, but hopefully that was of some use. There's probably stuff coming out right now as we speak. I'll have one last sweep. And I love this. This is exactly what I was just saying. So Shashank Joshi saying OSINT Fusion cross-checking Russian military bloggers with up-to-date and publicly available images from infrared sensors on NASA satellites. Exactly. I love that kind of fusion, that confluence of data. Anyway, I can't find any other up-to-date information, so that's pretty much where it's at. When I make light earlier at the beginning of the video, of course, we must remember that this is a war. People are losing their lives, and exactly the places we're talking about, lines on a map, represent people dying in large numbers, equipment being destroyed, and all for a futile project of a narcissistic, megalomaniacal, autocratic despot. So yeah, just bear that in mind. Nonetheless, thank you for watching. I hope this was informative and useful. Take care, and I'll speak to you tomorrow. No time, unfortunately, for an extra video today. So much content still to share, though, with you. So keep your eyes peeled tomorrow. Anyway, take care. Speak soon.